Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture. So now that we have reviewed the various forms and patterns of reasoning from the category of interpretation related to being arguments, and now that we've reviewed some of those on homework exercise number 7, let's take a look at argument fallacies in this same category, at least loosely related to this category. When we talk about argument fallacies, we're talking about reasoning mistakes, and these are almost as common as the forms of reasoning that we've been talking about. And I think you'll recognize as we go along that some of these ways of reasoning, which are flawed methods of reasoning, where the evidence does not support the claim or where the claim is not warranted on the basis of the evidence, that you recognize that these are also commonplace fallacies. So we've done a couple already, but I just want to review them quickly. We've talked about the Farfetched Hypothesis, and the Farfetched Hypothesis is an unwarranted explanation of facts. The explanation is unwarranted because it fails sort of common sense critical tests for a rational hypothesis or explanation. It either does not account for all the facts it's intended to explain, or it's not a simple enough hypothesis, or when considering other cases like it, it is not frequently the explanation that actually works. So here's an example. Maura and Nathan were absent on Wednesday. They must have been abducted by aliens. So we could ask, does the explanation account for the facts in the case? Well, sure, if in fact they were abducted by aliens, that explains why they weren't in class on Wednesday. It's possible they were abducted by aliens, so we would say yes, alien abduction would explain their absence. But when we move to the question of simplicity, obviously this is not a simple explanation. In fact, the explanation requires us to believe in extraterrestrial visitation in order to explain the facts of Nathan and Maura's absence on Wednesday. Not only do we have to believe in the existence of life on other planets, but we have to believe that that alien life came to our planet before Wednesday and that they abducted Maura and Nathan. It's a rather elaborate way of explaining something that could obviously be explained much more simply. And that's clear also when we consider the question or the test of frequency, because when we think about other cases of student absence, the cause or the reason has always turned out to be something other than alien abduction, right? It's students are sick, or they're skipping, or they had a conflict or a job interview or something else. All of those are much more frequent explanations and also much simpler explanations. And that's why the explanation of alien abduction would be obviously a far-fetched hypothesis. And then we talked about hasty generalization. So the unwarranted form of a generalization argument, an unwarranted general claim about a target population. The claim is unwarranted because it is based on insufficient evidence. The evidence is insufficient because, as we said, the sample is not representative. And it's not representative either because it's too small and or it's not done randomly, or it's biased. That is, it doesn't consider all of the differences that would make a difference in how people responded, for instance, to a survey. So a hasty generalization is an unwarranted generalization argument. So here's an example. O'Brien, O'Malley, McCarthy, Sullivan, Kelly, and Mahoney all drink Guinness. It's clear then that Red Sox Nation is a Guinness-loving group. So we would ask, is this claim warranted? The claim is the general statement, the general claim about Red Sox Nation being a Guinness-loving group. The sample here being O'Brien, O'Malley, McCarthy, Sullivan, Kelly, and Mahoney. That's the sample of 5. And we found when testing that sample that they all shared the projected property of drinking Guinness. And then we projected that property to the target population of the entire group of Red Sox fans known as Red Sox Nation. But is that a warranted claim? Is the sample representative? And in this instance, we would probably say, there's probably several million people in Red Sox Nation, and we have a sample here of only 5 individuals, or 6, sorry. And it apparently wasn't done randomly. Not every Red Sox fan had a equal chance to be in the sample. And especially we recognize that the sample is a biased sample. It includes only people with ethnic Irish names, and people who are of Irish descent or Irish ancestry might have a greater tendency to drink and enjoy Guinness, which is an Irish beer, than the typical member of Red Sox Nation. So for all of these reasons, we would say this is a hasty generalization. That is, we too quickly moved to the acceptance of the claim on the basis of the evidence, even though the evidence was an unrepresentative sample. So I introduce now a new fallacy, a fallacy called begging the question. And maybe you've heard this phrase used. It's often used incorrectly outside of the context of argumentation. But begging the question is a particular kind of reasoning fallacy. It's an argument that advances a claim on the basis of a disputed premise or disputed piece of evidence. It assumes the truth of an evidence statement and uses that presumed truth as grounds for drawing a conclusion. Now, remember what we said about claims and evidence. Claims must be controversial statements. They require evidence to support the claim. But the evidence cannot itself be controversial. The evidence has to be observable, or it has to be widely accepted as true. It can't remain itself something that is in dispute. And yet a begging the question fallacy uses as an evidence statement a statement that is still not proven or still disputed or controversial. So the argument is unwarranted. Indeed, it's without ground or groundless, because the evidence is not evidence at all. That is, the evidence doesn't have the status of evidence because it remains contested. It remains a matter of dispute. The evidence hasn't been accepted as true, so it does not function as evidence. But in a begging the question argument, such an evidence statement is put forward as if it is not contested, as if it has been proven or if it is taken as if it has been taken as true. So here's an example. Someone might argue because Obama is not even an American citizen, and any executive order he gave as president is invalid. We are not obligated to follow such orders. Trump should rescind them all. Okay? So here, the argument is that President Obama's executive orders are invalid, and so they should be rescinded by Trump. But it's based on the evidence, the alleged evidence, that Obama is not even an American citizen. So that's assumed as true, and then it's assumed as the evidence in support of the claim that his executive orders are invalid. But is it true? That is the evidence true? Is Obama foreign born? Is it true that he's not a citizen? The evidence here is assumed as true, but the evidence statement obviously is not uncontested, and it hasn't been proven or reasonably established as true. So this would be the fallacy of begging the question. There's a version of begging the question that assumes the truth of a conclusion and then in restated form uses that very conclusion as the evidence in an argument, which is meant to establish the truth of the conclusion, which has already been assumed as true. So you notice the circularity there, even in the description. So just like the begging the question, we assume that the evidence statement is true, and in this case, we assume it's true, and on top of that, it's not in fact evidence, it's simply a restatement of the conclusion in different words. And we know that the conclusion remains in dispute. It remains controversial because it's a claim. And so simply restating the claim in different language and then using that restated claim as evidence means the evidence also hasn't been established as true. And so we create a kind of circular argument. The claim is unwarranted because it rests not on evidence, but on simply a restatement of itself. So here's an example. The unexpected resignation of the Pope proves there is intrigue within the Vatican. The disloyal church bureaucrats maneuvered to advance their own careers and protect their secret agendas. The intrigues of this clandestine cabal of cardinals isolated Benedict XVI within his own church hierarchy, forcing him to resign. Now that all sounds very sort of complicated and detailed in presenting evidence. It seems as if it's the result of thoughtful analysis and the like, right? But if you look closely, the claim is the unexpected resignation of the Pope proves there's intrigue within the Vatican. And then you get to the evidence that is alleged here, right? There's actually no evidence that there's intrigue within the Vatican, simply a restatement of the same claim in different language. Disloyal church bureaucrats maneuvered to advance their own careers and protect their secret agendas. The intrigues of this clandestine cabal of cardinals isolated Benedict within his own church, forcing him to resign. So there's no actual evidence of such intrigue, simply a restatement of the claim in different language. So here's another example. This comes from a faculty senate debate from a few years ago, and the debate focused on the question of the balancing of credits for budgeting purposes between one college and the other. And in this case, liberal arts credits were counted less than the credits in SEPS and in CULSA and in the Paul College of Business. So as the argument went, under current budgeting guidelines, liberal arts credit hours are counted as 8/10 or 80 cents on the dollar for purposes of revenue distribution. Liberal arts credits are discounted because they are less costly to the university, and they are less costly mainly because liberal arts faculty earn lower salaries than those in engineering or science. So you can see here how this turns into a kind of circular argument. So we could ask, but that is, it kind of begs the question, right? Why are liberal arts salaries lower? One of the reasons liberal arts salaries are lower is because liberal arts gets lower funding. And why do they get lower funding? Because indeed, liberal arts credits count for less, right? So we're using the conclusion of the argument as the evidence in support of the conclusion. It creates a kind of circular reasoning that is a fallacy. Then there's another fallacy of grounding, which is called non sequitur. And non sequitur is a Latin term meaning simply it does not follow. That is, the claim does not follow from the alleged evidence. So this is a fallacy of grounding. That is, it doesn't have the evidence that it pretends to have, or doesn't have the ground to support the claim that it pretends to have, right? In this particular instance, it's a fallacy of grounding that advances a claim on the basis of irrelevant evidence. That is, the evidence doesn't speak to the point at issue in the claim. Remember when we talked about issues, we talked about how some arguments sometime, or some evidence in arguments sometime, can be what we call beside the point. That is to say, the evidence is irrelevant to the claim. So in this case, with this kind of fallacy, the claim is unwarranted because the purported evidence does not actually establish the claim. And that means there can be no clear inference made between the evidence and the claim that is advanced. So here's an example. A large majority of Catholic citizens actually use artificial birth control. The Obama administration's HHS mandate that required religious institutions, including Catholic schools and hospitals, to provide birth control coverage in their health plans is therefore not a violation of the religious freedom of those institutions. Therefore, it should not have been vacated by the Trump administration. But in this case, you see, what's the evidence? The evidence is a large majority of Catholic citizens actually use artificial birth control. But the claim is about religious freedom, right? And so it's a question of whether or not religious schools and hospitals should be required to fund birth control plans. That's a different issue entirely, right? And so the question of how many or whether Catholic citizens use birth control is irrelevant to the question of religious liberty or religious freedom of Catholic or other religious institutions. This would be a non sequitur. The evidence here does not speak to the point at issue in the controversial claim. There's another fallacy called appeal to tradition. And this is an argument that advances a claim on the basis of a presumption rather than evidence. You remember that presumption is an idea connected with the status quo. The presumption is that the status quo, the way things are now, is okay until someone presents good and sufficient reasons for changing the status quo. But the presumption itself is not evidence. It simply sort of sets up the sides of the debate. It identifies who has responsibility for providing the reasons. It is not a reason for maintaining the status quo in and of itself. But an appeal to tradition substitutes a presumption for the evidence. That is, the argument takes the existence of the status quo to be sufficient evidence in favor of sustaining the status quo. I like to call this New Hampshire's favorite argument, mainly because of it's the kind of argument that typically appears when the debate occurs about whether New Hampshire should continue to have the first in the nation presidential primary. one of the arguments that gets made is, well, New Hampshire has always had the first in the nation primary, so it should be continued. But that would be an appeal to tradition that substitutes a presumption in favor of the status quo instead of giving evidence for why New Hampshire should maintain the first in the nation primary if there's evidence or if there's a good case made that it should be spread around to other states from time to time. So tradition can be a reason, but it is seldom sufficient on its own to warrant a claim. That is, you can use tradition as one among other reasons why you want to preserve tradition. Tradition has value, and that can be a good reason to keep things the way they are. But simply the fact that things are like that now is insufficient as a reason to continue doing it, especially when the status quo has been challenged by a reasonable case. So the appeal to tradition fallacy, here's an example of that. A couple of examples, actually. The company has used PCs ever since it was founded in 1979. It would be foolish, therefore, to switch to Macs. But is there any evidence here that Macs are not as good as PCs, or that it wouldn't benefit the company to switch to Macs? No. The evidence given here is simply the tradition, that is, the status quo, the presumption associated with we've always done it that way or we've always used PCs. Same kind of thing in the second example. My grandfather drove a Ford, my father drove a Ford, and I drive a Ford. There's no way then that I'll let my son drive a Toyota. But you notice here the entire basis of the argument, the entire support for the claim is the tradition, the family tradition of driving Fords. There isn't any evidence here that Ford is actually a better car than Toyota, or that the son wouldn't benefit from driving a Toyota instead of a Ford. There's no evidence at all except the tradition within the family. So the appeal to tradition fallacy. Here's another fallacy, the ad populum fallacy. Ad populum meaning basically appeal to the people. It's an argument that advances a claim on the basis of popular opinion alone. The argument is unwarranted because popular opinion alone is an insufficient ground upon which to sustain a claim. Knowing the prevailing views can serve as some evidence, but should not be the sole basis for advancing a claim. So there's some obvious examples of this. You know, there was a time in American history where the prevailing opinion was slavery was fine, or the prevailing opinion was women should not vote. And if we just went on the basis of prevailing opinion, we might have maintained those traditions and institutions. But just because everybody thinks something is a good or right is not in itself good enough evidence. So an argument that rests solely on popular opinion is insufficient in evidence to support a claim of that sort. Here's an example. Most of the student body is strongly in favor of relaxing grading standards for UNH courses. The registrar, therefore, should change the official grading scale to ensure that a 70% is at least a B. So we obviously see the second statement here is the claim, and the claim rests on what? Evidence that simply comes from what most people in the student body are in favor of. And that in itself is insufficient. It might be one reason why we should change our grading policy, but by itself, it's not enough. Just because everybody thinks it's a good idea doesn't mean, in fact, it's a good idea. And indeed, doing something like this just because all the students want to do it would probably be a really bad idea, because it would very quickly lead to a decline in academic standards and probably then to fewer enrollments and less support from the state. So we have to look carefully, critically at the evidence and ask, is there any other evidence other than a lot of people think this is a good idea or a lot of people want to do this? Is there any other evidence that in fact this would be a good policy change, right? And you need that other evidence to add to the popular support for something to function as evidence and in support of a claim that makes for a warranted argument. Now, I also want to point out that you need to be cautious here that you don't confuse the ad populum fallacy with the generalization argument. And the way you can avoid that confusion is to look at how the reference to public opinion or general opinion, how that reference is used in the argument. In this case, with the ad populum fallacy, you will notice that what everybody thinks or the general opinion or popular favor, that's used as evidence, right? And so when that's used as evidence, what you should be looking for is the ad populum fallacy. But in a generalization argument, the claim about what most people believe or the statement about what most people believe or popular opinion, that comes as the claim in the argument, right? So in a generalization argument, the general statement is the claim. In ad populum fallacy, the general statement is the evidence. And that's how not to confuse the two. Then there's another fallacy of grounding, and that is called the straw argument. Used to be called the straw man argument. I guess that's sexist. So we now just call it the straw argument. But in any case, it's a fallacy of grounding that advances a claim on the basis of insufficient evidence. So like some of these other fallacies of grounding, the begging the question, the non sequitur, and the like, right? A fallacy of grounding looks at the relationship of the evidence to the claim and finds the evidence lacking. It's insufficient. And in this case, the evidence is typically taken out of context, or it's exaggerated in importance in some way, or the claim is advanced on the basis of a misrepresentation of the evidence. So the claim is unwarranted because the objections used as evidence are not in fact the positions taken by opponents. Rather, they're set up for the purpose of refutation, just as you would set up a straw man. Let's say if you're doing some kind of military training, you might set up a straw man just so you can shoot at it or just so you can stab it with your bayonet, and not because it's a real argument or a real person, but just because it's convenient for you to attack it, right? And that's where the metaphor of the straw man comes from. So we look for arguments that misrepresent, especially, this argument is especially useful or used very often in refutation. So we look for arguments that misrepresent the position of an opponent and then attacks that misrepresentation rather than the actual position of the opponent. So here are a couple of examples. For instance, the Christian right wants to impose their old-fashioned beliefs on everyone. That violates my freedom. Religious leaders should be banned from participating in politics. So in this case, the claim religious leaders should be banned from participating in politics is based on the alleged position held by some religious leaders claiming that they want to impose their old-fashioned beliefs on everyone. You see here almost a kind of begging the question because it's a misrepresentation of what the Christian leaders want to do. I don't know any Christian leaders who actually think that their purpose is to impose their old-fashioned beliefs on everyone, right? But that becomes the characterization of them because it's easier to attack that misrepresentation or that characterization than it is to engage the actual position held by religious leaders. Or we could take another example. Liberals want to confiscate every gun in America. It's time now for Americans to rally together so the government cannot take away our guns, right? Most liberals who advocate for various forms of gun control are usually not looking to confiscate every gun in America, but that becomes the misrepresentation or the mischaracterization of their position, because it's easier to raise funds or to attack a misrepresentation than it is to actually engage in the kind of thoughtful debate that would take the position of an opponent at its face value. So this is the use of the straw argument. It's used very often, especially in social media debates. You'll see loads and loads of examples of this if you just go through your Facebook or Instagram or Twitter feed, lots and lots of straw arguments. Here's one from very recently, for example. This was a meme that I saw, and my first reaction was straw argument, right? Shows a picture of Colin Kaepernick kneeling in protest, and the text says, "I need someone to explain to me how it's okay for a white cop to kneel on a black man's neck and murder him, but not okay for a black man to kneel in protest of that murder." But of course, is there anyone who has said that it's okay for a white cop to kneel on a black man's neck and murder him, right? Who thinks it's okay for a white cop to murder a black man? That's not what I heard anybody saying, including lots and lots of white cops who thought that the murder of George Floyd was absolutely wrong. But it's easier to make a point when you misrepresent or mischaracterize the position of your opponent, because then it's much easier to attack that exaggerated position. So we could ask, is this position actually asserted by anyone, or is it an exaggeration used to mischaracterize opponents and then easily attack them and aggravate divisions? This would be a straw man argument. Here's another variation of the straw man. And some of these straw man arguments isolate one objectionable element of an opponent's position and attack that as if it represented the entirety of the opponent's view. The objectionable element is exaggerated in importance, and so by that reason becomes a misrepresentation of the opponent's view, which is then set up for the purpose of refutation. It becomes the basis of attacking the opponent's view, even though it's a misrepresentation of the importance of a particular point within the opponent's whole program. Often such a move relies on a tacit agreement from a willing audience. So for instance, people who agree with you politically are not going to challenge your misrepresentation of your opponent's proposal. Here's an example. The budget solution of the Democrats calls for closing tax loopholes for rich people. But we've had enough of the Democrats always turning first to higher taxes and more spending. We should oppose the Democratic plan for reducing the deficit. So what we're talking about here, the claim is we should oppose the Democratic plan for reducing the deficit, but the claim is based on a mischaracterization of the whole budget solution of the Democrats, which includes closing tax loopholes for rich people. But notice then how in that second sentence, that becomes the totality of the Democratic plan. It is misrepresented then. The Democratic plan is mischaracterized, and then the mischaracterization or the misrepresentation becomes the evidence or the basis for opposing the Democratic plan for reducing the deficit. Obviously, closing tax loopholes for rich people would be one element of an overall budget solution, but it becomes the thing that's easiest to attack, raising taxes and all of that. So it becomes the basis for the refutation, and it's a variation of the straw man argument. There's a fallacy of language which is called equivocation. And equivocation results from a violation of the principle of consistent definitions. So again, going back to your value argument assignment, you know that it's important to define the terms at the beginning of the argument to develop a clear understanding of what the key terms in the argument mean. Then it's also important not to change the meaning of those terms as the argument proceeds. But that's what an equivocation does. That is, the key terms in an argument shift in their meaning as the argument proceeds. And that leaves those terms unstable or ambiguous so that they can't function as an evidentiary claim or an evidentiary statement. So an argument is advanced on the basis of evidence that depends not on the stable term, but on the shifting meaning of a term, which is assumed to be stable. So the argument is actually unwarranted because the terms of the evidence statement are not clear. They're ambiguous, and so they remain contestable. That is, we still have to ask, well, what does that term mean? That is, there's still dispute about the meaning of the term, and so because the term is not stable, the evidence can't function as evidence in support of the claim. So here's an example. His use of the photograph did not constitute a copyright violation. The image was in the public domain. He found the image on an unrestricted internet site using a public library computer. The photographer himself had made the image public when he exhibited it at the gallery last year. And almost everyone he knew had already seen the image on the public television program. So in this case, the claim is there was not a copyright violation. Why? Because the image was in the public domain. So if you use an image in a report, or if you're making your own documentary film, if you use an image in the public domain, it is not, in fact, a copyright violation. But what's the evidence that the image was in the public domain? Here, notice how that term public shifts in meaning as the argument develops. We have the reference to the public domain, which is a clear legal definition of what we mean by public, right? But then the evidence in support of the claim that it was in the public domain proceeds by a shifting meaning of the word public. We have public library computer. So when we talk about public library, we're not talking about the legal definition of public domain. We also have in the next sentence that the photographer who took the original image, right? The photographer made the image public when he exhibited it at a gallery last year. Of course, that's a different meaning of making the image public. It's not placing it in a legal sense in the public domain. And then finally, everyone he knew had already seen the image on the public television program. Of course, public here refers to publicly funded. A publicly funded broadcast network doesn't have anything to do with the legal definition of whether something is a copyright violation or whether a photograph is or is not in the legal speaking public domain, right? But the evidence appears to be a well-developed argument in support of the claim that the photograph didn't use of the photograph didn't constitute a copyright violation until we begin to analyze the shifting meaning and thus the ambiguity associated with the key term public. And that's how equivocation works. So if you have questions about any of these fallacies, post them on the discussion board.